When I started this channel about a year ago, I promised myself two things. Number one, that I would never make an in-depth video about the GOAT debate, and number two, that I wouldn't make a video ranking the greatest players ever. Because at that time, and still today at a lesser extent, the video market was oversaturated with these takes. But now I realize that making these types of videos makes sense in order for you to understand how I evaluate basketball and greatness in basketball. For example, if one were to have guys like LeBron and Kareem as the two greatest players ever, then they value sustained dominance. But if another person were to have Jordan or Bird as two of the greatest players ever, maybe they value a player's peak rather than longevity. The list can go on and on and on with these stereotypes, but with my opinion changing recently on who I believe to be the 10 greatest NBA players ever, I might as well make this video and explain why I believe certain players make the cut and why others miss it. But before we get started, let me say that this video is not intended to create disagreements, but it ultimately will. A player that I have ranked 8th may be 4th on your list, and you probably wouldn't be able to comprehend why I would have them that low. And that's ultimately a good thing. That means you have developed your opinion through research and your understanding of basketball. No list ever created is supposed to be the uniform opinion, or else I or any other sports media personality wouldn't exist. So I welcome all agreements, disagreements, and opinions in the comments section, and I'll make sure to respect your opinion as long as it's based on proper reasoning. And lastly, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel as we are on the road to 1,000 subscribers. Any and all support would be greatly appreciated and helps me show that you guys like these types of videos. So make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and without further ado, let's get into the list. Starting at the number 10 position, I have Hakeem Olajuwon. Hakeem's dominance on both sides of the ball will unfortunately be overshadowed by Bird and Magic in the 80s and Jordan in the 90s. But for an almost 10-year period, Hakeem made a strong case to be the best center in the world in an era that included maybe the deepest center pool in NBA history. What made Hakeem so special was his otherworldly athletic ability and elite footwork at 7 feet tall, as his soccer background translated perfectly from his early teen years. Then you factor in the basketball IQ and core instincts, as well as the ability to lock down some of the best centers ever, and it becomes clear why this guy was unstoppable for 15 years. So why isn't Hakeem ranked higher? Well, while he was dominant, like I said earlier, he was never the best until Jordan went on a 2-year baseball sabbatical, and in that time, Hakeem won his only MVP and 2 titles. And while he eventually got over the hump, you have to remember that Hakeem made only 1 finals in his first 11 years, and when stacked against the best the NBA has ever had to offer, his resume, both individual and team-wise, just doesn't compare. But what secures his spot on this list for me was his pure talent on both sides of the ball and consistent dominance over the great centers of his era. Coming in at number 9, I have Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq ultimately edges Hakeem on this list because even though he lost head-to-head in the 95 finals, Shaq's dominance in the early 2000s hasn't been seen since. And while there were certainly limitations in Shaq's game, like his inability to stay on the court in the fourth quarter due to free throw struggles, and some effort concerns in the mid to late 2000s, his play from 2000 to 2006 as a first or second option on 4 title teams was completely unstoppable. When Shaq posted up or got in the paint, there was virtually no way to stop him. And yes, it is important to note that the early 2000s had some of the weakest competition in NBA history. But it's not fair to criticize Shaq for something he has no real control over. Besides, he did his job and was easily the league's best player for 3 to 5 years, which is something that Hakeem could never say. The overall range of 8 to 12 feels proper for a talent like Shaq, because even though he was dominant, it never felt like he wanted to be the best, whether that be due to constant weight concerns entering the season, or his inability to fix problems in his game that existed since day one. So while many may put Shaq higher due to his unstoppable physical style of basketball, it felt right in my mind to put him at number 9. Because while his peak is one of the highest in NBA history, it felt like he had another level to reach that he ultimately didn't. Coming in at number 8, I have Magic Johnson. Magic was the biggest faller in my rankings reassessment just a couple of days ago, because while Magic was a dominant offensive threat that could attack you at all angles, he didn't have that much to offer outside of that. Sure, his peak was incredible, where in the late 80s he won 3 MVPs in 4 years and had 9 consecutive top 3 finishes. And in the playoffs, while he certainly had his downfalls, he also won 5 rings, albeit he also had some of the greatest teams in NBA history around him. But even still, he was never a dominant scorer until the mid-80s. He couldn't play defense at all, especially in the later years. And while the 5 titles are impressive, he didn't win a single one of them without Kareem on his team. It took him 7 years to grab the ropes from Kareem and be the true leader of the Lakers. But by that time, Magic would only play 5 more productive seasons before having his career cut short due to some health problems. And while he did make his return in 1995, he just wasn't the same. And if you look at it from that lens, you could be making the argument that Magic was only the best player in the world for 2, maybe 3 years before passing off the torch to Jordan. It's important to note that Magic was the first of his kind. A tall guard that could handle the ball and control the offense was never seen before this, and after his retirement, we've now seen hundreds of players attempt to replicate his magic, with only one eclipsing his greatness. In the end, while we should all look back at Magic's careers with fondness, he ultimately will fall to number 8 on this list. And now at number 7, I have Kobe Bryant. Now, unlike the previous 3 players who were all number 1 overall picks, Kobe was selected 13th overall in 1996 straight out of high school, which was certainly a risk for the Lakers, who traded away Vlade Divac, who was already a proven depth piece, for the 17-year-old. And by 2010, Kobe had won LA 5 NBA championships, including his last against the Boston Celtics, and cemented himself as the greatest Laker of all time. But that didn't come without struggles, of course. Because after Kobe and Shaq's falling out in the mid-2000s, Kobe was stuck on the Lakers putting up monster numbers just to fall short due to a lackluster supporting cast. And while one could make an argument that he was the most talented player in the world in 2005, he didn't have the success to go along with it. Because if you look outside of those 5 title victories and 2 other finals appearances, you'll see a lot of disappointing years, none at the fault of Kobe, of course. Because even with no supporting cast, his killer mentality and willingness to win always made it feel like he was head and shoulders above the competition, even if he wasn't. But with that mentality came its downfalls, of course. Because even in his worst of nights, he would continue to control the offense, sometimes to the detriment of the team. But that's just the story of Kobe, because you had to love him at his worst to make sure you got him at his best. And at his best, there was no one on the planet who could touch him. It was unfortunate that after his triumphant 2010 title victory, that his crown was taken by someone we're going to see later on this list. But in the end, Kobe's contributions to the game of basketball will never be forgotten, and his legacy as one of the 10 greatest basketball players ever will remain intact. And at number 6, I have Tim Duncan. Duncan is one of the most difficult players to rank on this list, as while his style of basketball was certainly not the most entertaining, his results and play at his peak could rival the entries on the top 3 of this list. Because while Duncan doesn't have his moments where he hit a crazy game-winning shot or dunked on someone, his steady play for almost 20 years helped the Spurs become one of the most important NBA franchises ever. It was Duncan who was drafted first overall in 1997 that led the Spurs to their first NBA title in 1999. It was Duncan who won back-to-back MVPs in 2002 and 2003 while grabbing the reins of the best player in the world from Shaq. It was Duncan who would arguably keep that title until 2008, winning 3 more NBA championships in 6 years, including a sweep over the Cleveland Cavaliers. And it was Duncan who held down the fort when it looked like the Spurs dynasty was over, leading San Antonio to a ridiculous amount of 50-win seasons, while being one Ray Allen shot away from winning back-to-back titles in 2013 and 2014, and ending hhis career with a 6-0 record in the NBA Finals. And when it was all said and done, Duncan ultimately retired in the shadow of Kobe Bryant, which was almost fitting for how their careers played out. Both at their peaks were unstoppable in different ways, dissecting the opposing team in every area to lead their team to victory. Both ended up with 5 finals victories. Both were widely regarded as the 2 best players in the league for a decade. Yet Kobe was the one who seemingly dominated the headlines and turned the most heads. And it makes sense, of course, considering Kobe had a flashier playstyle and was open to being a great personality off the court. But ultimately, it's Duncan who ranks higher than Kobe in my mind, simply because over the course of 15 years, the Spurs were always considered one of the 3 best teams in the West solely because of Duncan's efforts. And this is without mentioning his defensive abilities, which rank up there with Hakeem Olajuwon and a player that we're going to talk about in a little bit, and his leadership abilities. The Spurs are not the franchise they are today if Tim Duncan didn't sacrifice for 20 years, whether that be on the court, sometimes taking away his shots just so other players could get their shots up, or off the court, taking pay cuts in his later years so the Spurs could sign quality talent. It feels like we're starting to forget the greatness of Tim Duncan with every passing day. But at the number 6 spot on this list, he will undoubtedly be a top 10 player in NBA history for at least another 30 plus years. Now at the number 5 spot, I have Larry Bird. It feels wrong to put Bird at 5 and Magic at 8, but like with Tim Duncan, it feels as though we're starting to forget just how dominant Larry Legend was. I certainly did when I first made my top 10 list about 4 years ago, as at that time I put Larry at around the 7 to 8 spot. But then after diving further into his career, it made no sense to me why he wasn't a consensus top 6 player of all time. And it makes even less sense to me why people genuinely believe that Kevin Durant is greater than Larry Bird. If you look at the first 9 years of Bird's career, you'd think that he rivals the top 3 players on this list. Again, in just 9 years, he won 3 titles, 3 MVPs in a row from 84 to 86, finished All-NBA First Team 9 times, top 4 in MVP voting 9 times, and even finished as an All-Defensive Player 3 times. And at his peak, he shot over 40% from 3 on multiple attempts a game. During those 9 years, there wasn't a single thing he could not do on that basketball court. And while his final 4 years in the league were plagued by back and leg injuries, he still was the best player on 50-win teams, putting up over 20 points a night while receiving MVP votes. The only downside to Bird's legacy was his lack of longevity, and when you're talking about the best of the best, that's unfortunately going to keep him out of the top 4 on this list. But from a peak perspective, there's few he can match up resume-wise, and from a player standpoint, there was no player who could legitimately do anything on the basketball court like Bird could. It's a shame he gets buried in all-time conversations, but on my personal top 10 list, he'll have a spot for many more years to come. And here's where things may get a little controversial. At number 4, I have Bill Russell. Before you click off this video, let me explain a couple of things. First of all, I understand that Bill Russell played in the 1960s, where only 6 teams made the playoffs, and the competition was some of the weakest the NBA had ever seen. I also understand that if Bill Russell played in 2024, he would be nowhere near as great of a player as he was in the 60s. Again, this isn't a list of players who had the most talent. In my mind, it's a list that takes into account relativity, or the fact that not every player pre-2010 is going to have the same advantages or natural ability as they do now. What I'd like to look at is a player's pure dominance and ability relative to the players of their time. And in the 1960s, there was no one even close to Bill Russell in terms of dominance or overall greatness. In Russell's 13-year career, he was a 12-time All-Star, 12-time All-NBA player, 5-time NBA MVP, 4-time rebounding champ, and, oh yeah, a record 11-time NBA champion. This is all without mentioning his defense, which is in my mind the greatest the NBA has ever seen. Unfortunately for Russell, the all-defensive team only started in his last year in the league, but even then he was still voted on the first team all-defensive. If you base your opinion on NBA players based on their accolades, Bill Russell would be one of the 2 greatest players ever. So if I'm gassing up Russell so much, why isn't he the greatest player ever in my mind? Well, while Russell was incredible at almost every aspect of basketball, the one thing that he lacked was a scoring ability that rivals his peers. Don't get me wrong, Russell averaging 15 a game for his career certainly doesn't tell the full story. But compared to the top 3 on this list, he just doesn't compare. And while his peak was incredible, he only played 13 seasons, 2 less than Jordan and over 5 less than LeBron and Kareem. The second thing I'd like to talk about is the guy who I have 11th, Wilt Chamberlain. You may be asking yourself why I have Russell at 4 and Chamberlain at 11. It's because at every major stage, when the lights were the brightest, Russell got the job done and Wilt didn't. It's the classic team player versus stats guy. While Russell wasn't as talented as Wilt was, he made the necessary sacrifices to win. And in any sport, the ultimate goal is, of course, to win. Both guys played with similar supporting casts, both guys played in the same conference for the majority of their careers. But when it was all said and done, it was Russell holding up the trophy at the end of almost every year. And that to me defines greatness and why he's number 4 on this list. At number 3, I have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I was going to make a separate video on why Kareem is pigeonholed into the number 3 position of the greatest players of all time, and why he maybe wouldn't deserve that position, but that feels a little hypocritical when I have him at number 3 here. And the video would of course not have been made with ill intent. There's plenty of reasons why Kareem arguably had an underwhelming career, from struggles in the 1970s, which is far and away the weakest era of the NBA, to issues off the court with him being a terrible leader, which explains why he didn't find much success in the prime years of his career until Magic arrived in LA. But despite those issues, it would be foolish of me to rank him any lower, because the story of Kareem's career, at least to me, is sustained dominance. Don't get me wrong, Kareem had one of the greatest peaks in NBA history in the early 70s, leading the Bucks to their first NBA title and racking up multiple MVP awards in his early to mid-20s. But what's more impressive to me is the fact that from his rookie year in 1969 to his age 38 year in 1986, Kareem never averaged below 21 points per game and was never below the top 10 in MVP voting for each season. That's a type of dominance that even a guy like LeBron hasn't been able to match, as his personal best was 15 years with those qualifications, while Kareem's was 17 years. And during that entire stretch, Kareem proved that he was the first big that could do it all on the basketball court. He scored with the best of them, winning 2 scoring titles and averaging over 25 points for a season 10 times. He was one of the most prolific rebounders of the 70s, averaging more than 12.8 rebounds per game in 9 consecutive seasons, while leading the league once, grabbing 16.9 a contest in 1977. Defensively, Kareem was outstanding, using his incredible length in the paint to disrupt shots, and as a result, he was an 11-time All-Defensive Player and a 4-time blocks leader. You put all of those skills together, and you get the best player the NBA had seen in its first 35 years. When it was all said and done, Kareem left the NBA with 6 NBA titles and a record 6 regular season MVPs. There are many words to describe Kareem Abdul-Jabbar: influential, record-breaking, unstoppable. Yet the word that's been floating in my mind is underrated. Because even with his accomplishments and very high level of play that could very easily translate to today's game, we still pigeonhole Kareem into the 3rd spot all time. Why is that? Why is it when we talk about the GOAT that we skip immediately to MJ and LeBron and not shine a light on Kareem, who arguably has better accolades than both? That question will unfortunately never be answered, as his popularity 50 years past his prime is dwindling by the year, and stars like LeBron and Jordan will always be in the limelight. I mentioned earlier that I was going to make a video on why Kareem may not deserve to be the number 3 player ever, because instead of being 3rd, I think there's a solid argument for him to be tied with the 2 GOATs of basketball. But in the end, I determined that Kareem would fall slightly below the top 2. And before I get into who I have at the number 2 spot, let me say that I truly don't have much of an opinion on the GOAT debate other than that Kareem point that I made earlier. And while I will put one over the other for the sake of this video, I truthfully have it down the middle and would agree with you if you had one over the other. It's just an opinion and I will respect you no matter what you believe. So I'll get into it by saying that I have LeBron James as my 2nd greatest player ever. My first real memory of LeBron has to be the decision. I was just 6 years old when LeBron shocked the sports world by leaving Cleveland and heading to Miami. And at that time, I had no clue what this would mean for the NBA. But the years that followed were incredible for elementary school me. Because whether you love him or hate him, you have to admit that LeBron was must-see TV in Miami. He was the first player since Magic who had a forward's body, yet a guard's passing vision and speed. He was one of the only superstars to ever defend at a consistent, all-defensive level while scoring over 25 a game. And by this point in his career, his 3-pointer was a real threat. No matter what you did to defend LeBron, there was no real way to stop him. And after a major hiccup in 2011, he won 2 titles in a row as the undisputed best player in the world. And to prove everyone wrong, he went back to Cleveland and pulled off the greatest comeback of all time, defeating the 73-9 Warriors in the finals to win Cleveland their first ring. And then 4 years later, when everyone counted LeBron out after an injury hindered his first year in LA, he won another title in the bubble, cementing his legacy as one of the greatest players ever. This is all without mentioning those early years in Cleveland, where you could tell the talent was there, he just hadn't put it all together. But even still, LeBron ended up with 4 MVPs all within the first 10 years of his career, which when you look back on it feels extremely low for how dominant he was. He was a scoring champ, a Defensive Player of the Year runner-up, and a man who made 9 consecutive NBA Finals, a feat only matched by Bill Russell. My words won't do LeBron justice as to how incredible he was and still is. What makes LeBron so unique to this list is that he's still going now. And while Kareem was relatively a shell of himself by age 38, LeBron is still going now and looking like one of the 15 best players in the league. And while I don't have him at number 1, it's certainly not the wrong choice. And when he retires and I can look at his career as a whole, maybe he will be my greatest player ever. But for now, the number 1 spot is held by Michael Jordan. Like with LeBron, I don't think I can do Jordan right just by talking about his greatness. In his career, he was a 5-time MVP, 6-time champ, 10-time scoring champ, multiple-time steals leader, a Defensive Player of the Year, and overall the most famous player the NBA has ever seen. Greatness is a word with multiple definitions, especially when we talk about NBA players. In this list, there were players with dominant peaks, players with longevity, players with sustained dominance on both sides of the ball, and players who just flat out won when it mattered. And in my mind, the only person who checks all of those boxes is Michael Jordan, and that's why I have him as the greatest player ever. Now, in the argument between LeBron and Jordan, I believe we're looking at this the wrong way. First of all, the negativity towards both players is ridiculous. Both guys have had their downfalls, as every basketball player ever has had. It's childish to point out a flaw in one player when the other has flaws just as noteworthy. So instead, I like to differentiate the two through separate categories. In the greatest players of all time, I believe Jordan is number 1. In the best players of all time category, I believe LeBron is number 1. In terms of overall talent, I don't think it's controversial to say that LeBron is the most complete player we've ever seen, and his skills are greater than everyone else's. But in terms of pure greatness, sustained dominance, and overall impact, I believe Jordan is number 1. It's so dead even with both players that giving each their own category and moving on is the logical solution to stupid debates that happen on Twitter between a Jordan defender that was born in 2008 that has never watched a full 48-minute Jordan game, and the LeBron fan who was born in 1978 that stopped watching the NBA after 2016. It's okay to appreciate both guys while having an opinion, but that's a fact that many seem to forget. But in this list, I do believe that Jordan is the greatest player ever. If you disagree with this or any other opinions stated in this video, comment down below what you'd like to see change. And remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more NBA videos just like this one. So with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.